the current book that I'm writing on people-centric change is looking at change in a post-pandemic world.
Yes.
And some of these risks now are about how do we engage people that are working in a hybrid way or a remote way. So it's not, we're no longer working in an organization where you can get together for a short meeting. It's how do we include people that are working remotely? And the risk is that they will be forgotten about, that they won't feel that they're part of any decision making, or they're not part of any project management approach to change. So that's a real risk we're facing at the moment. And that's why we're having to do change differently to what we did, which means a shift from the top-down approach to change as well.
Welcome to episode 45 of the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing and enabling organizational change. My name is Ali Jama, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today, my guest is Julie Hodges, a professor of organizational change, an author, and a leading change management influencer. Through her extensive work in both global business and academia, Julie's area of interest and research is the impact of change on people and how to gain their commitment and ownership to change. As an author of many books, including the book Managing and Leading People Through Change, Julie shares an extensive wealth of research-based knowledge on the theory and practice of sustaining change through people. In this episode, Julie and I chat about the direct link between the way we manage change in the workplace and employee engagement. I am grateful to have Julie chatting with me today. Julie, thank you very much for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. Eternally grateful that you've accepted to having this chat with me.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Julie, today we're going to cover a very important topic around the relationship between managing change and employee engagement. We will cover a few topics from your books, and predominantly you've got a book called Managing and Leading People Through Organizational Change, a fantastic book. But before we dive deep into the topic, it will be fantastic for my audience to know a little bit about you, Julie.
Yes, indeed. So thank you for that. So I have been in academia for several years, and I focus on teaching, research, and consultancy in the field of organizational change, particularly people-centric change. That's my area of speciality. But before joining academia, I spent 20 years working in global businesses across the globe, actually doing change, doing transformation. So I worked for companies such as the British Council and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I worked for consultancy companies such as PwC, and also I worked in the financial sector too. So I have both that practical experience of doing change, such as mergers, acquisitions, restructures, that I actually apply now to my teaching, to my consultancy work, and also to the books that I write as well.
Fantastic, because usually academics are accused of not really being in the real world. So it sounds like you've got a great mix between the reality and the application of that reality in an academic setting. So fantastic. You've written the book, you've written a few books, but we're just going to focus on this one today. What made you write this book?
Well, when I first joined academia, and I was looking for a book that I could use in terms of my teaching, particularly with MBA students. I struggled to get something that wasn't in the populist camp, so something that wasn't very basic about how to lead and manage change, compared to something that was very highly academic. What I was looking for was a book that was grounded in theory and empirical evidence, that very, very importantly looked at how that could apply in practice as well. And I was also really keen to look at a book that had stories from people who'd been involved in organizational change that highlighted what they had learned, what were some of the, the things that had gone well and not so well. So that's what started me to write my books on change. And since then it has has expanded. The book that you mentioned is in its second edition, so that has been revised recently.
Yes.
And includes some new cases and some new approaches as well.
And I like that you've covered the populist side, the academic side, plus scenarios, plus also case studies for the readers. So it's really all around fantastic. And it is based on research as well. You mentioned in your book, or the general sense that I got out of the book is the organizational change is an emotive event. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, change is emotional because it has an impact on people. Change doesn't happen purely because a new system has been put into place or because there is an effective process for that change. Change happens when people, they adapt the way that they work, they adapt their behaviors. And that change can be, it hits how we feel about our work. It can be positive, so people can embrace change, they can see the need for change, they can be enthusiastic about that change and welcome it because it's going to make improvements to their work. On the other hand, change can be seen as being, can make people feel anxious or uncertain because they're not really clear about what that impact of the change will be. They're not sure if they will have a job at the end of it. They're not sure what might be the changes to their job as well. So it is an emotional process. But what happens, though, in the workplace is that we have to leave our emotions at the door. We become a bit sort of robotic when we come to work, in fact, and yet we bring our personalities. And I think what's often missing with change is just that, focus on how change will impact on people. And that's something that needs to be done up front at an early stage with change, because it's really important that that is recognized. A lot of the literature tends to focus on people resisting change, and that is seen as negative. But actually, that's an emotion that people have because perhaps they haven't been involved in the discussions about change and suddenly it's being imposed on them. They may have a better idea about what could be improved or done differently, but nobody, again, has asked them. They haven't been involved in the decision making. So they feel quite threatened, quite put out when a change is suddenly announced as well. And resistance can also be because people have ideas that they want to share, but again, they've not been asked about them.
And look, I always say, Julie, that I will worry if people don't ask questions. I will worry if people actually don't challenge me on why we're doing stuff. And because I do call that as a silent resistance anyway. I am one of those people that I can ask a lot of questions because without the answers, I will not be able to play an active part in the change. And the other thing is that resistance also, as you I think mentioned in a couple of chapters, that the not just the context but the history of the organization and how they manage change as well.
Yes, yeah, that is important. How people react to change is affected by lots of things. Our personality, our experience of change, as you say, the history of change in the organization. So if people are working in an organization where change has been successful, it's engaged them effectively, then they're more likely to have a positive view of any future changes. But then if it's the opposite, if there's been a history of failure or change, then people may be a bit more reticent. And I describe it a bit like, when you're driving a car, it's like looking in the rear view mirror.
Yes.
You have to look behind you to look at, what is the history of change? What are the ghosts of changes within the organization? Because that needs to be taken into account. And organizations need to do a review of organizational change to see what's been learned from it, what has gone well, what needs to be done differently, and then ensure that that learning is built into future changes, because change is all about learning, in fact, but it's building in some reflection time that's really important.
I will come to the point about management, and because you do talk a lot about management and their important role in helping employees and people adopt the change, or at least understand it as a first step. But you do talk about engagement at an individual level, at a team level, at an organizational level. Julie, does that mean that when we look at change, we also need to look at change at those three levels?
Well, I think, first of all, the role of managers in change is very important because these are the people that have to make the change happen,
Yes.
that have to implement the change. And often they tend to be a bit ignored in the literature. A lot of the literature looks at change from the leadership aspect, particularly the literature that focuses on linear approaches to change.
Yes.
It sees this change coming down from the top. But the role of managers is very important. And as part of that, they do have to look at the different levels that change is implemented. And change is implemented, can be across the organization. So if we're talking about restructures, if we're talking about transformational change, such as acquisitions and mergers, that will affect the whole organization. But it'll also affect teams in the organization. And then teams are really important in their role about making change happen too. So they need to be factored in when it comes to looking at how they're engaged. And then at an individual level, change affects us all. If it has an impact on our work, how we work and how we behave in the workplace as well. So I think these three levels are important: organizational, team level, and individual level when it comes to looking at change in an organization.
What are the risks of mismanaging change?
The risks are there's many. There's many. I mean, and particularly it's interesting, the current book that I'm writing on people-centric change is looking at change in a post-pandemic world.
Yes.
And some of these risks now are about how do we engage people that are working in a hybrid way or a remote way. So it's not, we're no longer working in an organization where you can get together for a short meeting. It's how do we include people that are working remotely? And the risk is that they will be forgotten about, that they won't feel that they're part of any decision making, or they're not part of any project management approach to change. So that's a real risk we're facing at the moment. And that's why we're having to do change differently to what we did, which means a shift from the top-down approach to change as well. The risk also is that managers impose change without talking to people, without having any dialogue with them about what needs to change, how it will change, but importantly, why it needs to change, because people need to know the rationale for change. Yeah. So it can be mismanaged if that is not communicated out. It can also be mismanaged because there is a lack of effective communication. And that also has an impact on what I've been talking about, people now working in a hybrid way. We need to look at how we communicate change differently now. Too many organizations do change by email, and we all know we're inundated with emails, and it's so easy just to delete the email rather than reading it. So it's about looking at how we can use more effectively the online channels that we have, such as Zoom, for example, and how we can create online the discussions that are needed about change as well. And a key risk at the moment is management and managers not having the capabilities to effectively lead change in a post-pandemic world. We've all had to learn very quickly over the last few years about how change happens. So there is a risk about them not having the capabilities as well.
I often think, Julie, that managers would need to have what we call change IQ. A manager's job is to come to work every day to help their people succeed. And how they do that, they make decisions, and those decisions become changes. And then how they manage those changes impact how their employees and people interpret those changes, and therefore ultimately how they feel about them. Have I got this close to accurate or practical reality?
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. I think it has to be embedded in people's jobs rather than it being something additional that people have to do. It has to be a key capability that people do need that in order to be able to effectively manage change, but also the recipients of change. It's really looking at what capabilities that we all need in order to deal with change and deal with the increasing pace of change that we're finding at the moment is happening across organizations.
In your book, I'm trying to remember the context of it, but I think you mentioned a model around the A plus B equals C, which is the A is the event, the B is how we feel about it, and therefore the C will be the outcome of that. I often think about change as the change is not really the goal. The goal is the goal, meaning changing a software is not really the change that we are after. That's a medium to maybe impacting the way we work and all of those things. So the way we manage engagement, you call it organizational changing engagement. The way we manage communication, all of those things will create that B in our people. If we don't focus on the B and therefore the change, we just drop it in there, the result will be substandard and ordinary. Would you agree with that?
So yeah, change is the way to make something different, isn't it? To adapt it, to improve it, to make it better, in fact. Yes. Yeah. Change is the way to look at what needs to improve or be done differently in terms of how people are working and how they are behaving as well. And it's the transition. I think there's also a transition that people go through, isn't it? From where they are currently in the status quo to what needs to be done differently, what the processes, the procedures, the behaviors are that need to be done differently.
It's not an easy task, Julie, to manage all of those things. I think, I don't know if you know, Dr. David Rock has written
his model.
Yeah, the SCARF model, and that's another way if you don't manage those things, even if they're not real. So the perception also can create problems. And so it's not an easy process to manage the change and turn it into a positive change experience. I always say that as a change practitioner, you can know the theory, but you need that deep level of wisdom to get you to that positive experience.
It's not, and it's about adapting the theory. It's about the literature is awash with different models and different checklists. Many of them, unfortunately, in a linear process. Change doesn't happen linearly; it happens in a cyclical way, and it's about adapting those to the context of the change, the context of the organization. And change should not be difficult, but what tends to happen is that these linear models are taken and they are then in a way cut and pasted. And that doesn't work because every organization is unique. Every change is different. So it's about adapting these approaches to organizations, because organizations are complex, they're chaotic, they're made up of people who behave in different ways. And I think that's what sometimes gets the press, that change is difficult because people try to, in a way, squeeze an existing model to fit their current context. But it's about adapting that. The organizations that I'm now seeing, and I've just worked with a global pharmaceutical company, have actually developed their own framework for change.
Yes.
So they haven't taken the traditional models. They haven't taken Kotter. They haven't taken Prozac. They have actually developed their own model for change that fits the context. And that has been based on a piece of research that I did for them. So it's based on empirical data. It's based on getting the views of stakeholders. And that information, that research has informed the development of the framework. And I hope that's the way that more organizations will actually start to go, in fact, because then they're getting something that is unique for their culture.
And I hope that we can help with that. I'm actually currently pushing the narrative that we need to customize the way we deliver change to organizations. So we can take that framework, but we can mold it in however way, because each organization is unique. They have their own challenges as well. I bet you that this organization you're talking about, I bet you that they actually tried the ProSci and the Kotter, and then they realized it did not work. It wasn't fit for purpose for them.
Yeah, I think what many organizations do is they use different models, or they have a favorite model that they use and they get stuck with that model. And a lot of these models were developed in the 1990s. Yeah. And the world of work has changed significantly since then. So, organizations that are trying to fit a model that, yes, was fit for purpose then is no longer fit for purpose now.
Previous episodes in my podcast, I have interviewed the ProSci people and the Kotter people. And we threw the question at them, is that when are you going to upgrade your model? Knowing, and they are pretty aware, and they're very intelligent people, and they're working on their models, fully aware that they need to adjust as well. I mean, if you're in the business of change, you're going to have to practice where you preach at the end of the day. You do talk about change as an emotive event. How do you measure the change impact on emotions? I've seen a lot of surveys that people do, but we never talk about emotions. We never talk about how people feel about the change. We talk about, do you believe in the values? Do you believe that, performance measures are fair and all of those things? Where do you stand on that?
So that's an interesting and a tough question. I believe that all change has to be measured. So there has to be some KPIs in place. There has to be benefits identified as well. So I suppose it's about looking at in terms of what is it that we expect to see done differently. Yes. Yeah. So maybe there may be something done differently in terms of people in their
as in behavior,
emotions, their behaviors. They're going to be more customer centric.
Ways of working. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I got you. I'm working on a project now with an organization, and we are actually looking at how different the ways of working for the employees. And so it's going to be an interesting exercise, which I haven't really done before. So quite elusive, the data. So I've got a lot of patience to actually go through it anyway. The way employees interpret change directly impacts adoption. And this is about the neurodiversity, because we all look at the picture from where we sit and we look at it. Some of us, like, for example, myself, I am comfortable to see a lot of uncertainty because that will allow me to explore. But a lot of people will be threatened by a level of uncertainty. So is there a direct link between the way we interpret the change and adoption?
I'm sure there is. I mean, in terms of, people who are open and advocates of change, they're more likely to very quickly adopt anything that's new. If there's uncertainty, and uncertainty is part of change itself. We all feel uncertain when a change is announced. Yeah. And it's about what are we can't take away uncertainty, because when we start a change, a transformation, if we start a restructure, we can never quite predict what the outcome will be, because there may be internal factors, external factors that will impact on that restructure. So we can't ever take away uncertainty. But it's about, going back to what we're talking about, managers, about their role, looking at what are some of the things that they can put in place that can help with that uncertainty. And one of the things is about understanding what is it that is making people uncertain. There's a great little model that I use in my teaching. It's called the hilltop model. And it's about managers standing on their hilltop and looking down and seeing what they see. But importantly, looking at the hilltop of their staff, because their staff are standing on a different hilltop and looking down, and they will see the world differently. Yes. And managers have to go across to the hilltop of their staff to really understand, what does the world look like? What does the organization look like? What does change look like from their perspective? So it's about seeing change from the perspective of others that's important. And therefore understanding what is it that people are uncertain about? What are they anxious about? And what are some of the things that can be done to alleviate that uncertainty and anxiety? And if we go right back, it is often because, and this has come out of the research and consultancy work that I have done, because people have not been told, do not understand, what is the rationale? What is the reason for this change? Yeah. So people need to understand. Ultimately, it's, they need to understand that what's in it for me and why. Why are we changing? And what's the impact going to be? And that can immediately, answering these two questions, can immediately take away some of the uncertainty that people feel about change.
Julie, engagement or employee engagement is not just a manager's responsibility. I always think about it as a mutual responsibility between an employee and a manager. We often say change is everybody's business. What's your comment on that?
I think that's right. I think it is the responsibility. I think it's often, or if individuals don't feel they're being engaged, they're not involved, and the culture is right. So it's a culture where they feel actually they can say, I'm keen to get involved in this project, or I'd like to know more, or, yes, what else do I need to do, and how can I get my team up to speed with this? So it's taking that responsibility as well to find out more about it as well. It's really important. I recognize that there are cultures where that doesn't happen for various reasons. And that's probably a whole different, podcast about how you can do that in a culture which perhaps is anti-change. But I think more and more, because change is something that we have, we've become familiar with, is more and more organizations are having to adapt their culture to be able to lead and manage change effectively. And I hope that there is a shift from change always being traditional, top down, or it's that burning platform, to being much more where people can come up with ideas. So, rather than waiting to be told what's going to be changing, it's about creating cultures where employees, frontline staff feel, actually, this is something we need to do differently. This would improve this process. And that, again, falls back on leaders and managers to create that culture, to create that what's termed the psychological safety, where people feel it's okay to say, this isn't working, but here's an idea of how it might work better.
Yes, and you're talking about moving from top-down change to co-creative change, which is basically far more sustainable and will impact engagement directly. And it's run by the people for the people as well. They still need frameworks, they still need governance, they still need guidance, and they still need support. They still need the change management team, but we are more of guardrails rather than hand-holding, if that metaphor is actually applicable here.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I think I always say that, change should be co-created whenever feasible to do so. And I do recognize there are times because of, regulations,
compliance,
legal situations, the pandemic, for example, where it wasn't possible to co-create change.
Yes.
But whenever feasible to do so, it should be. And your point's right about putting in some, parameters, some guardrails that help people to identify what's negotiable here and what's not negotiable here as well.
Yeah.
So that, again, gives them that the safety, the boundaries within which they have the flexibility, the freedom to co-create any change. Just to add on to that, I think these guardrails are about being very clear about the organization's strategy.
Sure. Yes. That's exactly.
And the values as well. They have to be part of these guardrails.
That's exactly why there are guardrails on there. Look, I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation, how there's a link between the way we manage change and employee engagement. And at the end of the day, we take a huge risk if we do not involve employees anyway. You can still manage to implement the change, but to sustain it will be a challenge. You're going to break the trust with your employees, and you may save some money because there's a time frame, but the cost longer term will be far greater than saving a few $1,000s in the present time. We are coming to the end of the podcast. Every time I have a guest, I ask them, I work in the business of change. What would be your advice to the change practice community when it comes to the relationship between how we manage change and creating that positive change experience for employees?
So I think it's about being very clear that change is not a top-down process. It's not a linear process. Mm-hmm. It's cyclical. Sometimes we have to go around it several times to get it right. I think it's about thinking about an approach that meets the context of the organization, that's important for the context of the organization. And very importantly, identifying who are the key stakeholders, who can influence the change, who will be impacted by the change, not just internally in the organization, but externally as well. And I would say embrace the change. There's so much out there that says X% of change fails. There's actually no empirical evidence that tells us that. So it's about how can we make change a positive experience, because it has had a bad press about being negative. If done effectively, and if a people-centric approach to change is followed, then we might just have a chance of making change much more of a positive experience.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I certainly will take that on board. Julie, it's been fantastic having you on my podcast, the Inner Game of Change podcast. How would employers, listeners reach you?
They can reach me through LinkedIn. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So please do engage with me there. I post lots of things on there about organizational change. So that would be the first port of call. Message me there as well.
And they're fantastic articles. I'm a follower and I'm a fan of your publications online. We really appreciate that. We're going to put all the information around how people can get hold of a copy of your book in the podcast. And I hope to get you back at some stage in the future, Julie, to talk about another topic. There are so many other topics that we can talk about. Very little time for this podcast. But until next time, Julie, stay well and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember, subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next podcast. Until then, stay well and stay safe.